Hello and welcome to Raising Anchor, your podcast and source for all things Rhode Island FC. I'm your host, Matt Entrican, and joining me today from the USL Players Association is Executive Director Connor Tobin. Connor, welcome to the show.
Hey, Matt. How are you?
Fantastic. Listen, I feel like this conversation has been a long time coming. I know that when we first connected, we had talked early in the year. I thought that by the summertime we would have some positive news to discuss and kind of celebrate some things, but it looks like there's been some circumstances, and we're in a continued discussion here late into October of 2025.
Yeah, it's been a journey this year.
A journey indeed. But thanks for sitting down for this conversation. Nevertheless, I know the main talking points of today are probably going to be some of the things going on in the current environment, and the progress or lack thereof, maybe. But I want to first ask you personally, as I was doing my homework and kind of getting ready to have these discussions, how does a defender from the Carolina Railhawks, or as we more commonly know it today, North Carolina FC, hang up the boots and decide, you know what, I'm going to move into player relations and become an executive director of the USLPA?
It's an interesting thing. It actually kind of ties back to my stop in Carolina, which is my third or fourth stop professionally. But when I joined Carolina, we were NASL 2.0, the NASL, and it was a really interesting time in terms of U.S. soccer, where we had two competing Division II leagues. Still a lot of instability was kind of the defining feature, where clubs coming and going in either league, kind of always up in the air going in off season, what's going to happen. And then 2017, the end of the season came and NASL folded. Several of the clubs, including North Carolina, moved across into USL. And that kind of furthered a discussion a lot that was happening with a group of older players about, hey, this instability is killing player experience. We have players on less than marginal contracts, some really kind of eye-opening medical situations that are not being sorted by the clubs. And basically, players need to see at the table, because this thing's got to stabilize and players need to be treated better. That led us to a bunch of conversations in 2018, us organizing, which I was a part of. Then it went to collective bargaining, which again, I was a part of. And so when I stepped away from Forward Madison in 2021, at the end of that season, I was already kind of in the role. I've been doing the work for 3 or 4 years already. So it wasn't like I made a decision when I stepped away that let me do this. It was like, oh, I'm already doing this, so I'm just going to continue.
But there was no path, there was no specialized education. You just kind of right time, right place, because a lot of players, they start getting ready to get to the tail end of their career. And they're like, do I want to coach? Do I want to get into player development? And this was the path forward, and no regrets, or has it been a great journey so far since?
It's certainly been a journey. I think if you had asked me in 2018 if I knew what this looked like, I'd be lying if I even said I understood a tenth of it. I certainly have a lot of passion for the role. It's, I think, a really important role that kind of flies under the radar, in terms of stabilizing professional soccer in this country and actually getting to a place where the sport is not just stable, but players within that are treated equitably, I think is a huge thing. I'd say there's a lot of aspects of my job that are not the most fun, but that kind of comes with the territory. But just keep plugging away.
So let's use that as a jumping point, because I represent Rhode Island FC as a fan podcast, and a lot of us are new to the league. But there's still sports fans amongst this group, whether it's the global game of football or other American sports. But I've come to learn really quickly that not a lot is known. There's not a lot of education when it comes to things like the USLPA or unions in general. It's like sports league, and they know there's some iteration of a union, but there's a bit of a learning curve, right? Especially with as the league is growing, as awareness of the game is growing. And like you said, the USLPA is relatively new. It started in 2018, and then that first CBA, or collective bargaining agreement, comes along in 2021. But can you walk listeners through some of those responsibilities? Because I think some people think they know it, but then I don't think that enough know exactly what the USLPA is designed to do.
Yeah, a couple different ways to attack this. I think first it's important to understand USL's business structure. And what I would say about that is unique within the American professional sports landscape. I say that because the league itself is privately held and they franchise out individual clubs. When that individual club owner purchases the rights to that franchise, it's a little bit akin to like a McDonald's. You get territorial rights, you get to write an independent business in that location. So the league and the clubs are not fully aligned all the way. And that makes for a really interesting context. It actually leads back to why we organized is, hey, you can go to Club A, for example, somewhere like Rhode Island, who does a pretty good job, and the player experience is pretty professional. You go down the road and you pick the next club, is not necessarily that case. So from a Players Association standpoint, and even their initial organizing group was, hey, how do we set minimum professional standards that no matter what club you're at, that you kind of have at least some semblance of like, this is what the professional experience is going to be.
And that's only at the championship, or does that branch? Because I believe you're an umbrella organization, correct?
Correct.
That branches to
Umbrella
USL One,
organization, which is another twist of this. So we represent the players of USL League One. That is a different collective bargaining unit, and we also have representation rights for USL Super League. So we are actually a gender integrated organization, which kind of gets to the second part of this. When we get to like a legal perspective, and this gets into U.S. labor law, and sorry if this becomes a little esoteric, we are the collective bargaining representative of professional players within that property. And by property, I mean league. And what that means is that we have the legal right to represent players in collective bargaining negotiations. Collective bargaining, we have status to talk about any sort of minimum economic or workplace condition pieces. So what we do primarily in terms of our organization is we try to negotiate better standards for players. We look to enforce those standards. And then there's kind of a parallel track where players at this level, there hasn't been a lot of infrastructure around them. There's a number of places where that experience has fallen short. So we do a lot of things as an organization to augment that experience and hopefully make it better for our workers.
In terms of those responsibilities and the priority of it, is a lot of it the proactive outreach and protection of the players, like things like the CBA, or, at this level, is it a lot of it reactive, like player grievances, disputes between organization and players? What's the balancing act there for you as a member, as the executive director of the USLPA?
I mean, I would say collective bargaining, first and foremost, is a proactive exercise. So let's get all the parties to the table, league, clubs, players, let's collectively bargain to figure out, what is balance for where the business is currently at. And then I think, and also an important part that a lot of people miss is during the course of an agreement, you're outlining what is a pace of change. So I would say by nature, it's proactive. I would say additionally, from my perspective, I have continued to beat the drumbeat with all the clubs and the league that, hey, the best way to deal with the problem is do it on the front foot. You have questions about our perspective or these sort of things, let's pick up the phone. Now, unfortunately, there hasn't necessarily all clubs adopting that, which means that we deal with some issues retroactively, which then gets more into kind of the grievance end of things and what does that look like, and walking through kind of a more formal process. I don't think what people realize that one of the features that I think is so foundational to a collective bargaining agreement that was lacking previously is outlining a more equitable grievance process. Historically, the contracts were written by USL. They were weighted towards the club. I don't think you have to go back too far to look at some of the experiences. One of our founding members was Tommy Heineman, who had at the time, pretty public disagreement with FC Cincinnati. This was the year before FC Cincinnati went to MLS, and it surrounded an injury that, or so claimed injury, where the club terminated Tommy's contract after the start of the season. Well, for Tommy to pursue that, he filed a demand for dispute resolution with the USL. I will give the league credit in this. They ruled on his behalf, But in terms of that process, the club had the right to appeal that decision to a full-blown arbitration in Cincinnati's market. I don't know if anyone's gone through a full-blown arbitration, but you're talking depositions, multiple kind of hearing dates. Think about the travel costs. And you're doing that as a lower league professional soccer player. How viable is that? So one of the things in getting to a first collective bargaining agreement was, hey, how do we have a more equitable dispute resolution process?
And that's the big difference, right? When I look to, the big brother in Division One currently, MLS as a single entity, that gives it a little bit more of an isolation on who are the players, who are the movers and shakers that move forward, both in the CBA conversation. Obviously, it is a collective whole on both sides, but you're dealing with one force versus in these instances, it must stretch the resources to have to be able to support multiple leagues, and then with all of these individual clubs as franchises instead. Like you said earlier, it's a completely different ball game. I guess I want to ask then, I look at here we are now with this current CBA expiring in 2025, and I look at where it started with the first CBA being started in 2021, but that was a runway, that was a ramp up after the USLPA had formed, almost 3 years to get across the finish line. Was that just the nature of what the right amount of time takes to get a first CBA done? With it's a discovery process, it's so new, or were there other things like COVID and other things that were going on around the world at that time that kind of caused the lengthier time before that first CBA was deployed?
D, all of the above. No, certainly I think one of the things we come back to is like we are dealing with a unique business structure. So the league, who's kind of the collective bargaining agent on behalf of his clubs, are brokering the deal, but they also have their own sets of interests. So in some ways, it is really a three-party negotiation. That dynamic, super, super complicated. One of the things when we first went into bargaining in 2019, that at the time, it's funny, we looked at the MLS CBA, which was, I think, 65, 70 pages. And we said, oh my God, that's so long. We want something that's simpler, easier to understand. I think our first bargaining agreement ended up at 87 pages. And this has everything to do with this. It's hard to overstate how much of an impact and how unique the structure is. And then how does that play out into all these different pieces that end up in a collective bargaining agreement? And then basically going from 0 to 1 and having to fabricate that is very, very hard. Then kind of have three different sets of interest, get lawyers involved, and that is a lengthy process. And then to coup de grace on this, throw COVID in the middle of it, this whole disruption of businesses. That was a very, very complicated thing. That said, I don't think that people realize how important getting to that collective bargaining agreement was, not just in terms of player experiences, but for the business itself, whether that's the league's business or clubs, and trying to get to some level of standard. I still don't think that standard is anywhere near where it should be, but at least getting to something has greatly pushed where this league has gone over the last 4 or 5 years. And then case in point, you look at clubs like Rhode Island coming in, you look at the environment that they've walked into. My personal take is the CBA and our organization has a big, big role in that.
Do you look, and I promise this will be the last time we compare to MLS today, but do you look, I mean, they had, 27 years now as a league. They went through these same pain points at one point. Do you look at the progress that you guys have made here within the USL infrastructure and kind of reflect back on what it was like in the early days of a CBA-less MLS as they started their process? And do you see yourselves as, on similar trajectories of improvement and getting there for the players? Or is it apples and oranges to make those comparisons, decades apart?
Apples and oranges. I think when you look at the history of where MLS was, you look at the model, single entity versus a franchise structure, it's almost like we went to two other polar opposite ends. So solving that, for example, some of the things with single entity, if I sign my contract, it's with MLS, MLS then assigns me to the clubs. There are some benefits of having a centralized system from an administrative standpoint. What happens if a player gets injured? Okay, he might have coverage through workers' comp insurance, but what state? Well, because MLS is all one place, it's state of New York. Well, here, given that, our direct employers are all these businesses in different places, how do we navigate that? we're dealing with one set of state legislations in Rhode Island, and then, hey, we go to Florida, and people don't even realize this is like Florida prohibits professional athletes from being on work comp policy. How do you actually cover a player who maybe tears his ACL while playing for Miami or Tampa or whoever it is? Those are all things from a collective bargaining standpoint. Well, when we're putting in, these are minimum standards we have to account for. We have to navigate.
It sounds like this is an ever growing knowledge requirement. And speaking to that knowledge, you look back at the first CBA, kind of steering into this now hopeful completion of a second CBA. What worked well in the first one? You mentioned how arbitration was a little bit more streamlined when it came to the injury process as a result. So what has worked well so far, and where are the flowers to be given, but where are the opportunities discovered, and maybe some of that's leaning into what your organization has so strongly spoken about online?
Yeah, and I think first and foremost was, for the first time ever at lower division, we drew a line in the sand and said this is what professional soccer is at a minimum level. So whether that's from a pay and a benefit standpoint, I would not say it's where it needs to be, but the fact that we even drew a line in the sand was a step forward. I also think in a number of places, because players had a formal seat at the table through a collective bargaining process, we get to a legally binding document in a collective bargaining agreement, which has allowed for us to enforce that agreement. And I think that's a really, really important part when we have clubs or the league that are not operating at standard. It allows us to file grievances, allows us to kind of wield a little bit of a stick to force them to comply to standards, which is always been kind of a problem for USL, because this variation in terms of professionalism across clubs has always been there. And you'd think like, hey, this is kind of the league's, Kuleana to kind of step in and manage that and bring people along. But again, if we come back to what these interests are, the league has its own set of economic interests. What is their willingness to take on some of these political fights to say, hey, that's not good enough, you guys need to spend? There are cases where the league has done that, but there are also cases where the league has kind of sidestepped and allowed things to go on. So a collective bargaining agreement has allowed us to step in as players and say, no, we are going to address this. We don't get to ignore this.
And what are those key things that you want to address? It's so far what it's looked like. It looks like equitable wage. It looks like the big one has been, the talking point I've noticed has been just, it looks like some sort of health insurance, workers' comp to protect players from injury. You'd think naturally that wouldn't even be something that needed to be on the table, that would be an automatic, but it looks like, again, long road, progress made, but not quite there yet. What are those things that this current iteration of the CBA is trying to champion?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty straightforward from our end. It's a minimum standard of professional pay. It's minimum standards in terms of professional experience, and a huge piece of that is employer-provided healthcare. Again, these are decentralized decisions. So we have a number of clubs that do provide access to health insurance, but we have a number of clubs that don't. And if we're talking about players and we're marketing this to say, hey, we're going to Pro Rel, we're going to Division One, we're doing all these things in the ecosystem, that needs to be in balance with how players are actually treated and what the day-to-day reality is. And so our focus is, what are those minimum things? Sign a contract within USL Championship. What are the baseline expectations, and how do we get to something that I think all fans and people watching the sport would say, yeah, that's a professional standard.
You just mentioned the Pro Rel, the Division One elements, which have been a big catalyst for conversations amongst the USL, putting it kind of on a spotlight here in the North American soccer landscape. In the current discussions for the CBA, and I don't know if you can share this at length, but are you looking for a shorter term CBA so that you can get to the point of getting right up against that Division One Pro Rel launch, learn what needs to be learned, and then kind of re-navigate into a longer term once we understand how the pyramid will impact an umbrella organization like the USLPA? Or are these current talks looking to future-proof and maybe extend the longevity of this next CBA into that point where, get a couple years under your belt of understanding what does D1 and Pro Rel look like, and then make those next decisions tactically?
Yeah, some combination of both. I think one of the things that's been really difficult, and this is no different than I think what a lot of the public has struggled with, what is the actual plan? And again, those are the same conversations that we're having, because it determines kind of where do we go from a USLPA perspective. What I would say about our focus right now is getting these basic standards and kind of the foundation right. These are the building blocks that make any future system sustainable, whether that's championship, whether it's pro rel, Division One. Every agreement that we try to do is to raise the floor and create a foundation that can support whatever direction the league goes. One of the foundational things from our perspective as a group of players is the player experience cannot be out of balance with what is being sold publicly. And right now that we feel like there is a imbalance between how the league is projecting itself and how players are actually treated day to day.
And we as fans see that. I mean, there's been stories this year that have diminished the professional experience. I think of, and I won't say names here, but we've heard of stories where, player conditions where there's no faculty for washing kits, taking care of boots. Players are having to take care of their own uniforms. There's been instances where playing conditions and travel alignments and allotments haven't exactly been fantastic. Each one of these times that the fans get a snippet of that, it seems to me like it degrades the standards you guys are trying to build. And it's a partnership, right? With the league and the club ownership. How do we, are those conversations when we talk experience? Like, does anyone look at the macro of the optics, or is that not a part of the business model right now? Because it's really more just make sure our players are getting paid and make sure our players are staying healthy. Like, does anyone have that conversation? Like, hey, maybe we shouldn't let these things get onto social media?
I think there's certainly some element of that, but again, to me, it's very simple. You don't want these things to end up in the public forum. Let's not do them. I think one of the things that's frustrating, again, I know I keep coming back to structure, but progress has been slow because the system's fragmented. At one end, you have clubs that are bearing a lot of the financial cost of building the infrastructure of the sport in this country and at USL level. So it's in stadiums, they're paying wages, they're the ones oftentimes that are directly touching what we're talking about in terms of kind of the player professionalism aspects. However, you have a privately held league that is also benefiting off of this level of soccer. They sell franchises. What is the economic flow of selling franchises? What does that come back to in terms of helping clubs financially, which in then turn helps clubs reach a better level of professionalism as it relates to players? Again, I will continue to harp on this. It's about balance, and it's about balance between all three entities, and we are out of balance.
So now I think I've heard that you're at close to 30 bargaining agreement discussions now, maybe even more since the last time I checked in. What seems to be the barrier to getting this across the finish line? What is the progress so far that's been going on? Obviously, I know you can't get into the particulars, but is this a holdout from the league? Is this a holdout from the club ownership? Because I think back to just the D1 discussions, and there was some transparency there that there were holdouts from the ownership group that were afraid of a lack of parachute payments, a lack of what relegation could do to them. And, they finally got that convincing to move forward. What's been some of the holdup as to why we're now, getting dangerously close to the end of the year? The regular season is now done. What are kind of the barriers there that you're experiencing?
Yeah, I think I just hit on it. It is literally, the system is fragmented. You have a league office that's trying to grow the brand of USL and the way they see fit, but then you have individual club owners trying to balance their own budgets. And then on top of that, we have not really a mandate for ensuring professional standards that are consistently professional. And until there's alignment on the basics, think things like fair contracts, healthcare, safe working conditions, we're going to keep hitting these same walls. It's a structural problem that needs to be fixed by leadership. And you have to be willing to talk about it. And I think that's one of the frustrating things from, I guess, the Players Association standpoint is we do not feel at times the foundational issue of structure is really being discussed between the club owners and the league. And how does this evolve? How does this stay in balance? And where does this go as this business grows? It can't just be something that's not talked about and then said, hey, there might be a problem here, but we're not going to discuss that. But that problem is also the reason why we can't actually provide professional, kind of standards to the actual workers that are playing week in and week out. That doesn't make sense.
So then what's the timeline moving forward? Obviously, the USLPA requested players and fans of the championship to begin boycotting, social media pages to apply pressure.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure what other tactics you are planning on deploying here as we start to run out of time and out of runway. But what do these timelines look like when it comes to how these negotiations are getting to the final minute here?
Yeah. So from a technical aspect, our collective bargaining agreement expires December 31st of this year. Now, just because we get to the end of that agreement doesn't mean, hey, we're necessarily in a work stoppage situation, either lockout or strike. Either side gets the potential to do that, but I would seem to think there's incentive for the parties to keep talking and try to figure this out. It's an important year, this upcoming year with World Cup coming. Obviously, the league's shown a great level of ambition in terms of Pro Rel and Division One. So we think there's incentives to go and figure this out. I think from a players association standpoint, we're committed to that process, but we're also just as committed to getting to a fair deal. And, we're going to see that process all the way through. And we're going to do what we have to do to get to a fair deal.
And then as an umbrella, I think of just my knowledge of, union efforts in, the more traditional workforce. Typically when there's alliances across unions, if one has a work stoppage, then, the others in solidarity will potentially start or target things. Like you said earlier, this is an umbrella organization. Is there a power to be leveraged? I'm sure it's kind of like your ace up your sleeve, but is there a power to be leveraged with the fact that it's both a championship, a USL1, and then potentially a future super CBA? Is that something, if need be? Because correct me if I'm wrong, but the USL1 CBA, it goes a little bit further into extension. There's a year or two left on that one. Is that something that would need to be possibly considered? Could this be something that impacts the entirety of the pyramid?
I think what you're alluding to is players' real power is that we create the product, and it's the player's voice, and it doesn't matter what the league is. This organization is about empowering players, and I think there's an understanding from our player pool about the importance of supporting players and amplifying each other's voices. So I can't say exactly what that looks like or what will end up happening in the future. I don't have a crystal ball, but I would say players generally understand the importance of supporting other players and making sure that we have a strong voice at the table in terms of where does this sport and where does this league go.
And how do fans get involved more? How do they stay more up to date with the comings and goings of the USLPA, the players themselves? How can fans get involved if they want to?
Yeah, I think a great place to start is just following at USL Players. Obviously, there started to be a little bit more from us in terms of commentary about this. I think that'll continue. I think another big place is actually asking questions on why. And not just, hey, I show up to the stadium and, I watch these great players play and, I watched Noah Fuson get another couple assists or whatever it is. It's actually saying, hey, what is this experience? Where is this going? I see all these announcements on new stadiums, and I see all these announcements on franchises. Well, how does this actually connect with what I'm watching on a Saturday night? And what's kind of the interplay there? So I think the way for fans to get more involved is just continuing to think critically, ask questions, and kind of pay attention.
And speaking of Noah, I didn't realize that he was the poster boy for USLPA. I went and saw a video of the organization. I believe a younger frosted tipped Noah Fuson is smack dab in the center of that video.
He was a teammate of mine in Madison, so got him out for a photo shoot when we needed some collateral, and he was great. We have a great locker room. Whether it's Amos, whether that's Clay, we have got some great leaders in Rhode Island. So, it's a great group.
So what's the final word then? What's the lasting message that you want to leave on Rhode Island FC fans and probably people from across the USL that are going to listen to this a little later today?
Yeah, I think it's kind of foundational. do we have a sport without players or fans? And if the answer to someone is, hey, probably not, then hey, how do we make sure that those two things are front and center in terms of where this sport is going? And that is why you should care about what is going on, because what we're trying to achieve is, hey, players making sure that they're taken care of as we continue to grow the sport at this level.
Well said. And Connor, I wish you the best of luck in your continued negotiations and discussions. I hope that we see the players be able to return to the pitch with no other impact, and that everyone can find a compromise and an equitable solution here getting into the end of the season. And best of luck for the rest of this year and the many other CBAs I hope to hear that you negotiate in your future. So thanks so much for coming on the show, and can't wait to talk to you again soon.
Appreciate it, Matt.